and I'm an urban planning candidate here at the GSD. And my thesis proposal today is discussing with you, beyond bike lanes, the best practices for supporting and encouraging women in transport cycling. On the next slide, I'm going to warn you, there's this purple box gets filled up with lots of terminology because last week I tried to explain my ideas in a grid and I didn't have a great way to capture that. So that's what I'm hoping to do. It'll make sense. There's a national focus on cycling right now. There's huge enthusiasm around it. There's lots of news articles being written, urban planners who are obsessed with it, transportation directors. Cities are trying to promote transport cycling as a way to deal with congestion, environmental sustainability issues, as well as livability and public health. And so there's this surge in investment and not a huge surge in bike share of all trips over several decades. But what you do see is, as a percent change, some pretty dramatic increases. The cities are trying to move beyond the people they've already attracted, which represent less than 1% of the population who are going to go out and bike no matter what the situation is. They're trying to reach out at least to the what they call enthused and confident, hoping eventually to reach sort of the Dutch mode of getting the interested but concerned involved and recognizing that there are some people who will simply never bike. Some of the building for bikes, the construction, this is data as of 2008 for all the cities except for Boston, which is current as of this year. They're building bike lanes, and then they also have an off-street network that is feeding into that system. And as they build, you can see that the more you build networks per population, you have a greater increase in cycling. Portland's the all-stars. They've got 5.8% mode share on cyclists, and they have particular corridors where it's just really designed for bikes, and you see incredible progress. However, they're building for men. This is the premise. The best cities in the U.S. still aren't even getting to 40% women is our share of their commuters, and because the rates of increase have primarily happened among men, the percent of women who are cycling has actually declined even just from 2001 to 2009. So the overall picture looks like this, just to sort of put all those tables together so that you can see the lanes are making a difference in attracting riders, but they're primarily men. And as a caveat, they're primarily white men, but I'm not addressing the minority issues today, or probably in this thesis, as a major focus. They're called the indicator species. Women in cities are seen as the indicator species because in the Netherlands, where everyone bikes, more than half of them are women. And in Germany, where a lot of people are biking, almost half of them are women. It's also an equity issue. If you're building all of this infrastructure, it's costly. This is just sort of a sense of how much infrastructure you might see on roadways costs. If you're only building something that is serving half of the population, that's a problem. As we look for explanations of why this is ongoing, we're looking at whether or not it's in transit and access. Is it just you build it, and the more you build, eventually they'll come? Why are women less likely to bike? How can we solve this gap? And the research primarily focuses on infrastructure. It says if you build this kind of network, if you build this kind of infrastructure, that will make a difference. But there's also some research out of Charleston about perceived risks. It's not just about cities being safer, it's about them feeling safer. And again, not clear how you can make that happen immediately. And then there are studies that look at why are women, as women, less likely to bike? Is it that certain ethnic groups are primarily male-dominated in other ways, or certain other class and gender decisions? And then, again, there's just, you've got to find that preferred facility type, but maybe there isn't a preferred facility type. The digital response, sort of the blogosphere and media, says there's all this other stuff you can do. You can work on fashion, and you can work on imaging, and you can work on stores that have the right thing. And these are some blogs that a lot of women that I know who bike really like. And they're fun blogs, but they're not solving any problems. They still make women sort of this amazing thing when they're on a bike. Like, it's amazing that I'm out in my skirt biking. It's amazing that my bike is so cute and pretty, and that'll get more women to bike. It's sort of like the pink bike theory, I would say. And then I struggle personally with sort of the images of women cycling. I have a separate sub-thesis that is not in this paper anywhere, but that is that women who bike in movies die. The top two images. This is literally like famous, well not famous, but romantic movies in which the characters are blissfully happy, smash. And like that to me is not a great way to sell women on cycling. However, I have to really promote, these are both advertisements I saw over the weekend. This is an ad, it's kind of blurred out, but for Accenture, working for Accenture, and this is an ad for New York Life, both of which say that girls on bikes are part of the new norm. Some more questions that I'm addressing, though, if we need to find role models, if the lack of role models is an issue that we're addressing, what kinds of programs are necessary, both by nonprofit organizations and by cities, to make a difference, and then how is it that we're going to affect overall perception? Why program evaluation? Again, it seems like it's a new strategy, or it's a strategy that's ongoing, but hasn't been much research in shifting modes and in shifting women to cycling. And programs can mean a broad range of things, including things like the Hubway bike share, but for the purpose of this research, primarily, it is on specific programs designed to work with and train women to bike. These are some examples, and at the bottom is Boston's Women in Family Cycling Initiative. So to clarify, I am both a student and an employee of Boston Bikes. So I'm co-authoring right now the Boston Bicycle Network Plan for 2020, which will be released at the end of the calendar year. And I co-founded with this woman on the right here, Samantha Herr, the Women in Family Cycling Initiative. So this is a pretty vested interest. Boston's Women in Family Cycling Initiative is about both supporting and attracting women and families in the Boston and surrounding area to bike, and again, it's primarily transport cycling. Honestly, while we care personally if more women are interested in bike racing or riding along the beach on the weekend, we don't care professionally about that for the purpose of this project. We think that there are 5 sort of holistic areas to address, things like bike maintenance and selection, family and household, fashion and style, advocacy, voice, a sort of lack of it, and then commuter literacy and comfortability, which is probably the biggest focus of our project so far. So we've done some feedback programs, a meeting of the minds with some experienced women cyclists who are really leaders in the Boston community, as well as a project we called The Wall, where we had a blog forum, and we went out in real life, there's a picture of us, with these huge poster boards, and we literally asked every woman who came across our path, why do you bike? And they're like, I don't bike. We're like, well, tell us why you don't bike. And we had places for them to write that out, and recorded some of our data here. We have been having 2 encouragement programs. We've had 2 women cycling workshops that were specifically for women at different levels of ability. And this is one of them, actually both of them are shown here. And then we also have a new Bike Buddy program where we pair up experienced cyclists with people less experienced cyclists who find out about us through a network of friends or on our website, and we partner them so they can ride together and experience that. And then finally, we have some future programs supporting women's bike ambassadors in workplaces, some focus groups, an online resource guide that we're putting together, and hopefully some Women's Wednesday rides. My thesis format is both a historical overview of the sort of culture that I've been through before in terms of infrastructure, women's empowerment, etc., a more comprehensive literature, an outline of other programs in other places, and then evaluating our best practices both for other cities and some monitoring of our own pilot projects. So I want to evaluate the pilot projects, prepare the initiative both in Boston to expand, and then hopefully create a format for other programs. There are not many women's cycling programs out there. A lot of them are run by bike shops, and they're very secondary because most bike shops are run by men, and they just think it's a good idea to get a larger customer base, not from sort of the larger holistic picture. I need to continue to work with the literature. I've kind of gone over some of it before, but looking at gender issues and bicycle programs as it exists in the literature. Best practices involves contacting the women who founded the other organizations I mentioned before, and then potentially interviewing some people who've been through their programs. And then a case study of our own tracking the pilot projects that we've done so far through interviews and surveys in the spring, and then just continuing to work in this area. And I need better data gathering tools, just sort of, I haven't concretized. As you'll see, this is not a very image-rich or graphically rich, and I think it's partially I need to work on framing my data gathering better. And then collecting both some more concrete figures and some flow of how people are working on this project. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. So first of all, did you?
Oh no, you do it.
Okay. Well, first of all, I applaud you for the effort in both what you're trying to do, I think, in your professional life and here, because I think it is an important thing. And I do think that women are kind of the indicators species. You've kind of succeeded when women feel comfortable to do that. To what degree, you may have talked about this a little bit, but to what degree do you think physical infrastructure, if you were going to kind of parcel it out between, say, physical infrastructure investment and policy changes, messaging, sort of attitudinal shifts, how would you kind of divvy that out?
I think that Boston, in particular, is too far away temporally from having the network that really supports true gender equity to assume that infrastructure alone will close the gap.
Sounds like an important point.
To bike in Boston at this point is to be on the Southwest Corridor, where it is lovely, and to arrive at Dudley, where you have no idea what to do and who has priority. And so even in an area where you're going to continue on the Southwest Corridor, there are some very dramatic gaps, and we don't have, even in the network plan, we're not going to get to the place where those gaps are closed well enough that I think we're going to really close the gap for another 5 to 10 years. And so I think that if you're going to start to close the gap now, or hope to close the gap, or get women on so that when the network gets filled in, it looks normal for women to be on it, that you have to do more than just build the infrastructure.
That explanation was really important, especially since you're working on the bike master plan, to say that you know, particularly partially from your insider perspective, that those gaps in infrastructure simply will not be achieved in a place like, or filled in a place like Boston. That then opens this obvious area for other, types of interventions, behavioral interventions, perceptual interventions. So that's, it seems like you actually have all those pieces, but I think closing that up a little bit would be really helpful.
Well,
and the only other comment I would add is, I think if you're going to interview women, you should interview men as well, because I think actually the divergence of what they list as their important yeses and nos is going to tell you a lot about how the system as a whole works.
Danish pointed that out last week on the wall sort of results that we made. Actually, a lot of them are not gender specific. And we are fairly cognizant of that, but it was part of our pitch to the mayor.
What were the problems?
I can go back to that. So this is kind of small enough for you guys, but the why I bike, a lot of them loved biking, it's fun. Well, that's not particularly gendered. Health and fitness, fast and easy, like all the reasons why to bike are very, okay, just so you like it. But the fear and safety, like that's going to be pretty non-gendered as well. I think maybe the stopping when you've had kids and then maybe not ever learning to ride a bike are some of the most uniquely female things, and those are the ones that we're trying to address the most strongly. But as you'll see, even that's a really small minority of the population, so we recognize.
I think your point's such a good one, because it's actually really hard to know whether these are gender-specific responses without that sort of counterfactual.
We're pretty aware of that, but it's
Yeah.
part of our, this is one of those things where it became a political pitch more than a research-based method,
Right.
and we acknowledge that gap.
I think that I appreciate your enthusiasm. I think that's very good as an activist, advocate for women to bike. However, though, as academic research, I think there could be some rigor added as long as a framework. For example, this is good. You start to interview people, but let's say what's their age? That's the difference if you interview a 15-year-old versus 55-year-old, right? And I think there is some kind of research rigor that can make this convincing, which is not there. A lot of very subjective, conclusions saying women don't bike maybe because they love fashion, maybe because they wear skirts. Okay, so I think there needs to be first-hand and second-hand research. First-hand, you really interview, design some kind of questionnaire, not just face-to-face, send them out, and then gather them and analyze the data to see if you can find some kind of pattern. Okay, and number two, second literature. Okay, you do have the literature review. The even literature review does not seem to be focused on any kind of subject. It's like, okay, someone wrote about this, someone wrote about that.
Right.
Okay, and then you mentioned about physical infrastructure, and then there must be some kind of analysis for me in my mind. Maybe because it's too narrow, or maybe the bicycle lanes, or maybe it's too wide, or maybe because it's dark at some point. So we want to see that kind of rationale that's guiding this, rather than just an activist pitch, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's probably what you need to strengthen, and therefore it would make it much more convincing. Not to mention, I actually have a question even about your thesis here, that really that there is that big difference between men and women. I see your data, and Boston is low, but the situation is you didn't really analyze the whole population. Maybe New York has more people that bike because their population as a base is much larger than Boston. So there are a lot of unanswered questions embedded in this presentation. I think if you really kind of design a method and framework to guide your research, this could be much better and more convincing.
Thank you, Vic. Go ahead.
Yeah, we talked about this before because I'm in your nuns category. And so one of the things that I think maybe goes along a little bit with what Bing was just saying, but the first thing that I would just say is don't assume that your audience knows about biking. Because there are things like physical infrastructure or just biking culture in general, that if it's only 7% of the population, your audience isn't necessarily going to be in that population. So I would frame your intro with a little more sort of attention towards like, this is, towards some of the basics and some of the, and it seems like you wanted to do that and you just didn't quite get there, but
I consciously left out a fair amount of stuff at the beginning because the thesis isn't addressing should we build more bike lanes. It's about asking.
No, I just mean some
If
of
that
the
makes a
some of the terminology, I think, and some of the sort of discourse and culture about biking in cities. I think just to outline that, you started with we all know that cities are really trying to get more bicycling, but instead to start with here are 5 cities and this is what they're all introducing these things. Just a little bit more specific. But the other thing, I guess I had 2 other comments. The first was, it seems like it might be really challenging to evaluate a project as it's going, especially in its early stages, because you won't have a very large sample, and you'll be
my
learning
largest
as you go.
frustration, or like my greatest skepticism about doing a thesis is that the pilot projects are so piloted, and I'm so involved. Like on some level, it means more to me to work on the project than it does to write the thesis.
Yeah.
And
Well, I don't think the two are compatible, but it goes back to Bing's question about that means that even more so in your case, you really have to think through, well, what is the methodology? But I actually think it's going to that will really improve your professional.
But I struggle with like some of the rigor. Like I know, like if I was to go out and cite like sections of the Southwest Corridor, say, and track, is there a difference in the number of women on each of these areas? I could go out and do those counts, but I would constantly be asking myself, well, then I want to compare it to the GIS map that says that more women live in this part of JP, or that women are only going to bike this far from these jobs, but really the jobs for women are primarily located in hospitals. Like, I'm going to go, and I can parse out the data to the point where, like, all of the counts are meaningless.
Well, this all has to inform your method. I think this goes back to Bing's point, right? There's a lot of moving parts in the kind of evaluation you're going to conduct. Also depends sort of what kind of level of, what kind of results you want to drive. Are they very specific? Are they more almost a bit ethnographic? Are they about individuals and how they respond? Or are you trying to draw super generalizable results, right? And depending on how you hope to understand this, how many people are in your program, those are all going to inform the kind of methodology.
And that brings me to my last point, which might get to some of the rigor in a little bit of a different way, but I found myself wondering about women in cities more broadly, and equity and access for women in cities and public spaces more broadly, and discourses about urban design. And I feel like that's a different way of getting at the relevance of this issue that would get you beyond, you might not choose that particular entry point, but it's one entry point for this being not just about biking, but something that feels less activist and more academic. I know that in planning that's sort of a hard needle to thread because we're all activists, that's why we pick our projects. But if you were to frame it with something more like that, like discourse about women in the city and equity or something like that, then you might get yourself, at least your audience, towards something that feels a little bit more objective and convincing. And I personally just think that would be really fascinating because gender gaps aren't just about infrastructure or culture. They're about gender gaps, and that's an important thing to address.
Yeah.
Let's go to the new Belinda, and then quickly Joyce.
So I think that, I mean, clearly there's a huge problem here, and I think the motivation both from an activist side and from a research side is fairly clear, and you know, and I think the way you set up the problem is great. Again, characterizing it, so comparatively, is there I don't know if there's a comparative dimension, you mentioned some statistics initially, but how was was there a gender gap in the Netherlands initially, and then how was it closed? You know what I mean? I think that part of the, and that could be ethnographic data, that could be actual data, I mean, you know, so these are, in some sense, comparative cases. How is that done? I mean, and that gets, you know, when you said you want to capture the interested but concerned, so why are they interested and why were they concerned? Right? And there must be comparative data on that. And I feel like that is again, to just to benchmark this and try to give some perspective on it. You know, there's a gender gap in the U.S., but there wasn't elsewhere. That's one sort of question. The other would be, in terms of addressing it, I'm not always super convinced about addressing a problem head on. There might be better ways of addressing a problem obliquely. So I'm not entirely convinced that the blogs were doing anything, because if the blogs were about, if the problem is perceived risk, and the blogs generate a feel-good atmosphere, then they might indirectly, obliquely, be addressing the risk problem, not directly. Same thing with the bike shops, you know what I mean? Their aim is the customer base. But if they generate, in generating a larger customer base, in generating larger traffic through bike shops, they might bring down perceived risk, you know what I mean? So a lot of times is just, you know, addressing problems by saying, okay, women are the problem, talk to women directly about women's problems, and kind of, you know, it's like as a minority when you talk directly as a minority, it's like, actually no, you know what I'm trying to say? But going at things something obliquely sometimes is better than addressing it head on. But those are just two observations. I think it's a great project.
Okay. Well, I think it's a very unique opportunity you have because you are actually working for that in the city of Boston. So I think that's amazing. Just to link your personal interest with your professional interest, and I think, well, in comparison to some other kind of projects which are very abstract, I hope your findings will improve the city of Boston. So I think, you know, we have to encourage you to do a great work. Okay. Then the second thing is, I wonder why you, I mean, that's a personal thing, you don't have to answer, but I just wonder why you focus so much on women, because for me, as an outsider, I just arrived into the city, I don't know it that much. It calls my attention, there's very little bikers, so it's not about the women, it's that it's so few, there's so many cars, with men and women driving, so I just wonder, but of course I understand, okay? Then, you know, this gender issue, I find it so complex and so tricky, because, you know, it would be interesting to know, you know, what are these women doing through the day? You know, are they going work, then they're picking the kids, and then, you know, how does it work? And maybe it's not just that they don't bike, it's just that there's such a huge gap, social gap still, you know, about, you know, you were mentioning just slightly that it's mainly white men, you know, right? Maybe because they have a nanny, they have somebody cooking in their house, they have their wife, so they have so many things already fixed, it makes life easier. So I think it's a social thing, and it's so deep and so complex that for me it's kind of scary, you know, just to try to simplify it. I just wonder, you know, what do you think your outcome should be out of this? And then, and then regarding the outcome, like, would it be, how would you envision your outcome? Do you envision to come to some kind of conclusions and make an advertisement from the city saying, you know, cycling is healthy for everyone, or you're trying to do a kind of a more open social approach, trying to rebalance the roles of wives and husbands, or mothers and fathers, or men and women, or I don't know how to call it, because I think it's, you know, everything is kind of related. And then just the last thing, I'm doing a studio here, and it would be fascinating if I could get you to our studio, because there's two people working on bikes. One is she was very upset because she got her bike stolen, and from that point she has developed a project which is linked to kind of map the bike crime and how to, yes, she's kind of making, she's been in contact with the police and she has so many data and she's doing a website to be able to share, to share advice and ideas of how to keep your bike not stolen, but also try to, well, I mean, it's interesting. And another one is also on the mapping side, and he's developing an app so that you could actually have with an accelerometer, and so that you can actually have a visualization of how narrow, safe, dangerous the different bike tracks or bike lanes are around the city. User built, so it's not he's doing it. So it would be great because you are working for the city of Boston. They're going to give it to you, this work, and I think it would be fascinating.
You might want to touch base with Nasheed Nabian, who's actually in the other room, who's doing some really interesting work with sensors, and I know some people who work with her tried to use sensors to try to...
Yeah. Really.
Should we go Tony Joyce? Or either Joyce, please.
Just a quick question. How much did the scholarship on gender in public space inform your methodology? I'm sorry I had to miss your talk, but I wonder if you tapped that literature for a conceptual basis or a methodological framework.
I have not read a lot that is U.S. based about gender in public space, which isn't to say I wouldn't be really interested in it. It just hasn't been the focus of the literature review.
Alice and I have talked about this before, and it's a fascinating topic. I think you've gotten a lot of good suggestions today, but they've made your problem even worse. I think what you have to do is sit down and write out a list of all of the possible reasons why women bike less than men. And then map that against what's been done. Maybe a fairly convincing job has been done to say that they're more sensitive to infrastructure than men are. And what's not been done, and then figure out of the not been done, what you can conceive of. Interviewing the cyclists or observing cycle volumes, there's a lot of things you might do, but all of them are expensive if you're gathering. Expensive in terms of your time if you're gathering primary data. So you really only want to do it if you're pretty convinced that this is a very important cause of the gender gap and that you actually learned something from it. It's striking how many. Linda just gave me a new hypothesis, right? That women's travel patterns are more complicated because they may be stopping to pick up a kid or
that was in a past iteration of write-up.
That's really...
And if I am not doing it as a babysitter, which is a woman, so, I'm not liberated, it's always women. So doing maybe some catastrophe tasks.
But the problem is there's a dozen of these hypotheses. You really have to figure out which ones have been done already, at least to some satisfaction.
I think that's really helpful because it goes back to something we've been talking a lot about in the class, about how, looking at the frontier of knowledge, where are you going to make that contribution? Where can you sort of have best effect? And some of these hypotheses, it goes then to Bing's question about methodology, depending on your contribution, looking at the literature that exists and the potential hypotheses you might pursue. Some of those might be best pursued using like this broad data sets that allow you to make generalizations, and some of them, if they're about those very sort of more narrow patterns of everyday life and how biking fits into that, maybe that's a more sort of quasi-anthropological sort of methodology. But then, if you're very explicit about where you're making a contribution, you can tie it directly into the methodological focus. Awesome. So great feedback today, Alice. Way to go.